A mob boss put Sammy Davis Jr. on stage. Dean Martin shut him down in Las Vegas on March 8, 1964. Sammy Davis Jr. was humiliated in front of 3,000 people by a mob boss who punched him on stage. The audience was frozen in shock, but when it seemed like no one could help, Dean Martin did something no one expected. What he did next changed the course of the night. The Sands Hotel showroom was filled with the usual laughter and clinking glasses, but tonight something felt off. Sammy Davis Jr. was on stage, doing his usual act, singing, dancing, cracking jokes, but when he made a light-hearted joke about the mob, a deep tension filled the room. From the back of the showroom, a voice boomed, slurred with alcohol, "You think you're funny, Sammy." The audience froze, unsure if it was part of the act. Sammy, visibly rattled, tried to brush it off, but the man in the audience, mob boss Angelo, was already on his feet. He stormed the stage with a dangerous fury. This wasn't part of the show. Sammy's mistake had triggered something much darker, and Dean Martin, just 20 feet away in his dressing room, knew instantly that something terrible was happening. Dean Martin had seen it all in his years performing in Las Vegas, but this felt different. Sammy was more than a colleague, he was a close friend, someone Dean considered a brother. But Sammy, a black man in 1960s America, had faced his share of obstacles. Sammy's conversion to Judaism, his interracial marriage to Swedish actress May Britt, and his place in the entertainment world made him a target for hate. The Rat Pack had protected him, but even their influence couldn't shield Sammy from everything. Now, in front of a crowd, a mob boss was using racial slurs, attempting to humiliate Sammy. And Dean, he couldn't just sit back. Sammy was being threatened, and Dean wasn't going to let anyone cross that line. Not in front of all those people. The stakes were high, and Dean knew that stepping in could cost him everything. As Sammy stood there, blood trickling from his lip, the mob boss taunted him. Angelo, drunk and furious, was the type of man who wouldn't hesitate to kill over a slight, and Sammy, despite his talents and fame, was no match for a man like him. As the audience watched in stunned silence, Dean's mind raced. This wasn't just about defending Sammy, it was about something much bigger. The mob had already controlled so much in Vegas, but this was different. Sammy wasn't just a performer, he was a symbol. If Dean didn't step in, it would be a silent acceptance of the mob's power. Dean didn't hesitate. He walked toward the stage, his steps measured, knowing the danger but driven by something stronger than fear, loyalty, and justice. The time to act had come. Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most versatile entertainers in the world, renowned for his ability to sing, dance, act, and play multiple instruments. But behind that talent was a man who had been forced to navigate a racist and unforgiving world. He had made it in Hollywood, but at great personal cost. Sammy had faced death threats, been banned from performing in certain venues, and had been humiliated by the very industry that had once embraced him. Still, he carried on, buoyed by his friends in the Rat Pack. But this night, at the Sands Hotel, everything changed. Sammy had cracked a joke at the expense of the mob, not even mentioning Angelo, but the mob boss couldn't let it slide. Angelo's anger was personal, and his public assault on Sammy was meant to send a message to Sammy and anyone else who dared disrespect the mob. Sammy stood tall despite the humiliation, but deep down, he feared the consequences of defying someone like Angelo. Dean Martin had always been the calm in the storm. His easy-going demeanor and quick wit had made him a beloved figure in Las Vegas. But underneath that charming exterior lay an unshakable sense of loyalty. Sammy wasn't just a friend, he was family. And for Dean, family meant everything. But what he was walking into tonight was more dangerous than anything he had faced before. Mob bosses didn't just threaten careers, they destroyed lives. Still, Dean had seen enough. When Sammy was on the floor bleeding and humiliated, Dean knew it was time to act. Sammy was his brother, and no one, not even the mob, could get away with this. As Dean walked toward the stage, the fear from the stagehand's warning couldn't stop him. Sammy was counting on him, and Dean wouldn't let him down. The moment Dean stepped onto the stage, the tension in the showroom escalated. The crowd held its breath, watching as the battle of wills unfolded. Angelo stood over Sammy, still seething with rage, but Dean didn't flinch. He walked directly toward the mob boss, his voice calm but firm. "Get your hands off my friend," Dean said, his words cutting through the tense silence. Angelo turned, a malicious grin spreading across his face. He was drunk, and his arrogance was clear. "Perfect," he sneered. "Maybe you can teach your friend about respect." Dean didn't flinch. He wasn't here for a fight. He was here to make a stand. Sammy was his brother, and Dean wasn't going to let anyone touch him. Not on his watch. Dean stood his ground, unflinching, as the mob boss sneered at him. The air in the showroom grew heavier with each passing second. Angelo's associates, sitting in the front row, began to rise from their seats, ready to back up their boss. They knew Dean was a tough guy, But nobody in Las Vegas, not even Dean Martin, had ever dared stand up to the mob like this. The room was thick with tension. 3,000 people sat frozen in their seats, afraid to even breathe too loudly. But Dean wasn't intimidated. He knew the stakes were high. If he backed down now, Sammy would be left exposed, and the mob would gain even more power. Dean was used to the stage, but this was no performance. It was a confrontation that would decide much more than the night's entertainment. He stood tall, staring down Angelo, daring him to make the next move. This wasn't about physical strength, it was about showing that Dean wouldn't be intimidated. Not by anyone. As Dean and Angelo faced off, Sammy remained on the floor, blood dripping from his lip. His heart was racing, the humiliation stinging as much as the physical pain. The band stood still, not knowing what to do. Sammy was a seasoned performer, but in this moment, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in his life. Angelo's words, the racial slurs, the punch, it was all too much. But as he looked at Dean, standing firm and resolute, something shifted in Sammy's heart. Dean wasn't just standing up for him, he was drawing a line. A line that said no one would get away with disrespecting Sammy. A line that said the Rat Pack would protect their own, no matter the cost. Sammy's mind raced. He knew Angelo was dangerous. But the fact that Dean was willing to face that danger head-on filled him with a surge of pride and gratitude. This was more than friendship. This was brotherhood. The tension in the showroom was palpable, every eye locked on the confrontation. Angelo's fury had reached its peak, but Dean Martin stood unshaken. "Leave now," Dean repeated, his voice calm. But there was an unmistakable force behind it. Angelo sneered again, his face contorting with anger. He had power, he had the mob, but in this moment it felt like Dean was the one in control. The audience held its collective breath, waiting for Angelo's response. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. The mob boss's associates hovered, ready to act. But Angelo didn't give the signal. He looked around, eyes darting between Dean and the 3,000 pairs of eyes watching, judging. Finally, the silence was broken. Angelo stepped back, a low growl escaping his throat. He was beaten, but not without a fight. He may have been the mob boss in Las Vegas, but in that moment, Dean had won. The mob boss, despite his anger, had to walk away. Dean had done what no one else in Vegas had the courage to do. He'd stood up to the mob and protected Sammy in front of 3,000 witnesses. As Angelo turned, Dean didn't move. He just stood there, still as a statue, making sure the message was loud and clear. No one, not even the most feared mob boss in Vegas, could touch his friends without facing consequences. Sammy slowly got to his feet, his lips still bleeding, but his heart swelling with appreciation. He looked at Dean, his eyes filled with gratitude and respect. "You didn't have to do that," Sammy whispered, but Dean just shook his head. "I did," he said simply. "You're my brother." The audience, which had been frozen in silence, finally began to react. A ripple of applause started with just one person, then another. Within seconds, the entire showroom erupted into a standing ovation, honoring Dean for his courage and loyalty. Backstage, as the applause continued, Sammy and Dean exchanged a quiet, meaningful glance. Sammy had been humiliated in front of thousands, but Dean had given him something more valuable than just protection. He had given him a voice. He had drawn a line in the sand, saying that nobody, not even the mob, could cross it. Sammy wiped the blood from his lip, still feeling the sting of the punch, but now a sense of triumph washed over him. The man who had assaulted him was gone. The man who had humiliated him had been forced to leave, not because of violence, but because Dean had shown that there were limits that even the mob couldn't cross. Sammy wasn't alone. He never would be again. And as the crowd continued their applause, Dean placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's finish the show, Sammy," he said with a grin. And so, with the audience still cheering, Sammy began to sing. The show must go on. Backstage, Tommy, the young stagehand who had tried to warn Dean, was pale as a ghost. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Dean had stood up to a mob boss, someone who had the power to end his career, or worse, his life. "Dean, what have you done?" Tommy asked, his voice shaking. Dean just smiled, as calm as ever. "What needed to be done?" He said. He wasn't scared, not anymore. He had crossed a line, yes, but it was a line that needed crossing. No one could ever say that the mob controlled everything in Vegas, not anymore. Sammy, his best friend, had been assaulted. But Dean had stood between him and danger, and he had won. As Tommy walked away, still in disbelief, Dean sat back in his dressing room. He knew that things in Las Vegas would never be the same. But that was okay. He had protected his friend. He had proven something to himself, to Sammy, and to everyone watching. In the end, that was all that mattered. In the aftermath, word of what had happened spread like wildfire throughout Las Vegas. People couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Dean Martin had stood up to Angelo Martinelli, one of the most dangerous men in the city, and had forced him to back down. It was a bold move, and many thought Dean was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. The Rat Pack, who had always backed Sammy, were furious at themselves for not being there. Frank Sinatra in particular felt guilt. He would have loved to have been there, to stand with Dean, but there was also a sense of pride. Dean had done what needed to be done, and he had done it alone. Meanwhile, in the casinos and backstage areas, talk of the incident was all anyone could talk about. Sammy was untouchable now. And as for Dean, he had become something more than a performer. He was a protector, a man who would stand for what was right, no matter the cost. Soon after, Dean received a phone call. It wasn't from a friend or a fan, it was from someone much more dangerous. A senior mob figure, someone higher up than Angelo, had heard what happened. "What you did last night," the voice said, "took guts. Stupid guts, but guts." Dean listened quietly. He wasn't sure what to expect. "You've made a big statement, Dean," the man continued. "Angelo's been dealt with. He won't bother you or Mr. Davis anymore. But you need to understand, this was a one-time thing. Don't make a habit of this. Next time it might not be so easy." Dean wasn't sure if he had just received a threat or an offer, but either way he was okay with it. He had done what needed to be done. And now Sammy was safe. Sammy Davis Jr. never forgot the night Dean had stood up for him. For the rest of his life, whenever someone asked him who his best friend was, Sammy didn't hesitate. "Dean Martin," he'd say, with a knowing smile. "He's the one who would die for you." Sammy understood now what it meant to have someone in your corner who would risk everything for you. It wasn't just friendship, it was brotherhood. And Dean had proven it that night in Las Vegas. The night that the mob learned that there were limits to their power. The night Dean Martin drew a line that would never be crossed again. Dean had made his mark on Las Vegas. People would talk about that night for years. It wasn't just about the music, the gambling, or the performers. It was about one man's courage to stand up for what was right. It was about showing the world that even in a city run by the mob, there were still people who wouldn't be bought, who wouldn't be silenced. Dean had drawn a line in the sand, and as the years went by, that line became a symbol of resistance, a symbol of loyalty, and a symbol of friendship. It was a story that would be passed down for generations, not because of the violence that could have occurred, but because of the silent courage that stood in its place. Dean Martin wasn't just a performer, he was a hero. The legend of that night in March 1964 spread beyond Las Vegas. It wasn't just another story of a celebrity standing up to the mob. It was the story of a man who had shown what true friendship meant. Sammy, for his part, always felt a deep gratitude toward Dean. He knew that Dean had risked everything for him, and that was a debt Sammy could never repay. But he also knew that sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is your loyalty. Sammy would go on to perform for many years, but every time he took the stage, he would remember that night, the night Dean stood between him and the mob. It was a moment that defined both their careers. And it was a moment that would never be forgotten. Years later, when Sammy was reflecting on his life and career, he would often think back to that night. He had been beaten and humiliated in front of thousands, but Dean had been there to protect him. And in the end, it wasn't just about standing up to the mob. It was about the lesson that sometimes, it takes one person to change everything. Sammy never forgot Dean's courage, and in his heart, he knew that no matter where life took them, Dean Martin would always be his brother. The story of that night became more than a memory, it became a symbol of what true friendship meant. As the years passed, the legacy of that night only grew. Dean Martin had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had changed the course of his own legacy. He had been known for his charm, his wit, and his easygoing nature, but now he was remembered as a man who had the courage to stand up to the most powerful forces in Las Vegas. And in the end, that was what made him a true legend. Sammy, too, carried the story with him, telling anyone who would listen about the time when Dean Martin risked everything to protect him. It was a story that lived on, not just as a tale of defiance, but as a reminder of the power of loyalty, love, and friendship. The legend of that night became a story that was passed down for generations. It was a story of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between friends. It was a story that reminded everyone that sometimes, standing up for what is right takes more than words, it takes action. And Dean Martin's actions that night proved that no matter how powerful the enemy, there is always strength in loyalty. The story would live on as a symbol of the power of friendship, and the courage to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. Dean Martin's act of bravery that night forever altered the landscape of Las Vegas. If you want to hear more stories about unforgettable moments and real-life legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. Who do you think would stand up for their friends like Dean did? Let us know in the comments below.